When you're in a job and you have that title on your business card and you have your job description, don't put yourself in that box. The creative potential of asking AI to answer some kind of question could definitely tap into a world of other ideas.
So a lot of leaders are talking heavily about step out of your comfort zone. That's where the magic happens.
Don't ever be anything but your authentic self. That's the path to success.
Welcome back to CEO Behind the Scenes. I'm Chris Dutton, founder of the CEO magazine, and today I'm joined by Janice Price. She's the president and CEO of ROM Governors, the philanthropic foundation that supports the Royal Ontario Museum. Janice has built a remarkable leadership career across North America, holding multiple CEO roles and leading major cultural institutions through moments of profound change, from launching new organizations from scratch to navigating global crises. In this episode, we'll explore what bold leadership really looks like, why cultural institutions matter more than ever to civil society, and how organizations like ROM must think and operate like businesses to secure their future. Janice, welcome to the podcast. Janice, for those meeting you for the first time, can you briefly introduce yourself and share the journey that led you to the role right now as president and CEO of Royal Ontario Museum Governors?
Absolutely. It's been a fabulous journey. I feel extremely lucky because I've held so many wonderful roles. And the Royal Ontario Museum, the Governors, is the foundation that raises funds to support the exhibitions and the operations and all the activities of the museum, which is Canada's largest and most visited museum, encompassing natural history, art, nature, lots of dinosaurs. It's an amazing place. I actually started my career originally in media. So I started in television as a program director and a promotions director. So I was doing PR and promotions and marketing. And then I made the move into the performing arts, lively arts, at a wonderful concert venue in Toronto called Roy Thomson Hall, the home of the Toronto Symphony. And they also run the historic Massey Hall. And I had a good few years in that role in the performing arts. And then I was recruited to become director of marketing for the Stratford Festival, the globally renowned Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario. Had a wonderful time there as director of marketing, special projects, working for Stratford Festival. And lo and behold, didn't I then find myself in the United States? And so it's been a bit of a journey. There's two big jobs in the U.S. as well before I return back home to my home in Canada, including Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York City and the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia. Sounds like I can't hold down a job.
Well, you're a fascinating lady, and I've got so many questions to ask you, but you mentioned dinosaurs, and I saw them on your website. What are these dinosaurs? And they're real, and what make and model are these dinosaurs?
We have a globally renowned paleontology department and natural history department at ROM. We're very proud. I always say, the kids really love dinosaurs. And my amazing Dr. David Evans, who's the head of the paleontology division, says, you know what? There's a lot of dinosaur nerds out there, and they're not all kids. It really is quite incredible. We have wonderful specimens. We also have casts of very fragile, important dinosaurs that we can't show them in their original form, but we do very precise, very scientific casts just to show the world and demonstrate the beauty and the fascination that never seems to end for people with dinosaurs.
Please tell me you've got a T-Rex.
The T-Rex. I'm not the expert. I just raise money to make sure the T-Rex always has a wonderful home. We had an exhibition a few years ago on T-Rex, and it became one of the most visited exhibitions at ROM for sure. But we're coming up on an amazing exhibition that will be opening at the end of this year on raptors.
Wow.
And how some raptors actually lived. There was one small kind of raptor, a very bird-like raptor, that actually lived with in partnership with and safely with T-Rex. So that's another fantastic exhibition that we have coming up this year.
Sounds amazing. And you mentioned that you've had several roles, obviously, across North America. So what first drew you to arts and culture as a place to lead?
I was always interested in the arts. I loved theater. I was, always in my high school musical or my university play. And I was interested in it from, believe it or not, it's hard to believe that even as a younger person or a university student, you would know. And it's one of the things I really like to convey to young people in our sector or earlier in their studies. It's a business. There's massive amounts of jobs and satisfaction and ways that you can become engaged in work within the arts and culture sector. And it's not all about being in front of the camera. It's not all about even being maybe behind the camera as a cameraman. There's thousands and thousands of people that it takes to run a major performing arts center. And it's in publicity and PR. It's in artist services. There's so much that is available in this field. So I was drawn to the field because I loved arts and culture as a consumer. And luckily for me, fairly early in my university career, I became aware that it actually is a business, and there are careers that you can make in arts and culture that is not about being an actor or a singer or a dancer. And that's why I've been fond of saying, I often say, my business card in all my leadership roles in major arts and culture organizations around the world should actually say not a title, but arts enabler. That's what I do. I see my job as being the person who helps enable the arts to happen, be it through fundraising, leadership in administration, HR, it doesn't matter. There are incredible organizations dedicated to bringing all of that work to the public, and you need people like me behind the scenes helping make that happen.
I'm glad you touched on earlier in your career. So looking back, what would be some of the sort of bold decisions that you made early that have kind of shaped who you've become today?
Always being incredibly curious. When you're in a role, and I know this is about, speaking to women CEOs, young women building careers or men building careers, I would give this advice to anyone. When you're in a job and you have that title on your business card and you have your job description, don't put yourself in that box. Just keep your ears open. Keep asking questions. Have coffee with someone who does a completely different role from you and ask them about that role. So for me, there was curiosity. There was a great capacity to actually welcome change. So, there's all the psychological worlds that say, what are the biggest fears people have in life? And, major life changes are part of that. But there's something to be said for that little bit of fear of, take that risk, make that move. Often when I give speeches, especially to young women in the field or women in university, and then I preface it by saying, do not go home and tell your parents I told you this, but don't be afraid to move. I mean, move geographically. I have moved to, 5 different cities and places in my career. So you really have to be someone who says, I can take that passion, but I do have to be ready to keep an open mind to new opportunities, new ideas. And sometimes that means leaving home and going and doing what you want to do somewhere else.
You've touched on something that many leaders we speak to talk about. You've mentioned about being curious and being bold or brave or taking risks. And I'm talking about the comfort zone. So a lot of leaders are talking heavily about step out of your comfort zone. That's where the magic happens. What are some examples you can give me of times where you've stepped out of your comfort zone?
Moving from my hometown of Toronto to New York City. I knew the city. I had done some work and had relationships in the city, but that was a big move. The other, I think, would be saying when you first are given the opportunity to take that step up to leadership, to CEO level leadership, there's a natural tendency to say, well, I've been very successful in this particular area of my career. In my case, it was largely marketing and public relations, communications, that type of thing. And then, as I said, you talk to other people and you realize, I've heard a lot about how does fundraising work? How does production work? How does finance work? And then you're given that chance and someone says, okay, are you ready to be a CEO? And there's always that moment of self-doubt. Do I have all the skills? Can I do it all? And that's where the mistake comes in. You don't do it all. You embrace the fact that sometimes you're out of your comfort zone. I'm not a CPA. I'm not a CFO. I understand how to run the finances of our organization, and I'm very conscientious about that. But I put good people around me with those skills. And so I think the thing about the counterbalance to, am I a little out of my comfort zone is, we can't all know everything and be everything, but you have to be secure enough and confident enough to put really good people around you who have those skills. And so suddenly discomfort becomes very, very comfortable when you have fantastic people around you who fill in any gaps you may have in your skill set.
You mentioned about you've relocated for a lot of roles. You've built Luminato up from the ground, and you've led through moments like 9/11 and COVID. How did those experiences shape how you think of leadership today? Because you've led through some challenging times.
I have led through some challenging times. I was asked once, while I was still living in Banff in Alberta, to give a talk in what we believed was beginning to be nearing the end of COVID. And they said, can you come and speak to our executive leadership group on resilience? And I found myself thinking, resilience, okay, we all use that word. We use that word a lot. And I went right back, to what's the dictionary definition of resilience? And I found far simpler than you would think, not that complicated. And the definition was resilience is an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And so when you boil that down, you say, okay, we're always going to have some misfortune or change when we're leading organizations or in our own lives. So how do you become resilient? It's that ability to recover from or easily adapt to. I said it's simple. I've just made it sound simple. Of course, you have to have a lot of ability to make very difficult decisions. So, for example, in COVID, we had to make difficult decisions because we had to shut down all our revenue-generating activities, and we did have to lay off staff. And it was a temporary layoff that became, for some, more of a permanent layoff. We didn't lay off all our staff, but a significant number of staff. And you have to have the ability to say, in times of challenge, what are the most important decisions that must be made quickly and with confidence and with absolute certainty? And who do I need to involve in helping me make those decisions? So you convene the right group of people, you listen to all the input, and sometimes there's not always consensus, but you listen to everyone, you bring your own thoughts and instincts and leadership abilities to the table, and you make the decision. Because the worst thing that you can do in times like this is not make a decision. You must decide. And I've often said to my teams, you know what? A bad decision or a decision that you end up wanting to change later, you can always react and you can adapt to, but there's action happening. No decision is the worst decision. So you bring decisiveness to the table. 9/11, I was living and working in New York City as VP of Marketing and Communications at Lincoln Center. And, that was an extraordinary world event. And not dissimilar to COVID, unlike other kinds of institutional change, perhaps, there's always an element of humanity that you have to bring to the table. We had to make some very quick decisions. We had to support people who had lost friends and relatives. We had to keep the ability of the arts to actually be an antidote to some of that pain. So that was another example. But you do always have to bring humanity to these kinds of situations.
I love it what you said about resilience. My personal thought is it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be in tough times, but it's how you react and adapt that is the most important. How much would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I always go back to that dictionary definition: your ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And so if you put that in front and you say, okay, well, what is my ability today to recover from a challenge that's just been put in front of me, as big as 9/11 or COVID or some smaller thing within your institution that is important and meaningful? I think if you put that in front of you, that's your job as a leader. That's your job as a CEO. You have to recover from and adapt easily to change and challenge.
A lot of our audience and people listening to this podcast, they're not just C-suite leaders, they're emerging leaders. They're people that they aspire to be these people. What advice would you give to those people about taking risks, especially when the road ahead feels a little bit uncertain? What would you say to them about taking risks?
I would say, the word risk inherently, it seems to come loaded with a fear component to it. Oh, risk, I'm going to jump from a tall building and hope the bungee doesn't break, or, risk. There's always degrees of risk. There's a risk that is, should I go for that next level of promotion? Do I feel I'm ready? And what's the risk if that doesn't happen? Well, my leadership team knows that I aspire to more senior roles. And if I don't get it, I still have my job. So I think the word risk has gotten a bad rap because it does seem to come with that notion of automatically you hear risk, you're like, fight or flight, protection. I think risk is incredibly exciting. Taking a risk can be incredibly liberating, because when you take that risk and you find out that nothing bad happened, then it empowers you and enables you to be confident to take more risks. So, as I say, there's degrees, of risk. A very common phrase is calculated risk. So, have you sat down and thought, okay, first off, why do I think this is a risk? To think something's a risk, you have to think that there's some kind of consequence that potentially is going to come from that. And so what is the potential consequence? And the more you analyze it and think, why am I even thinking of this as a risk? Sometimes when it comes right down to it, it's like, actually, there's not a lot of risk here. No one's going to lose their life. And so I think just doing the proper thinking analysis, don't be rash, but don't always automatically think that risk is a scary thing. Risk is what pushes us. Taking a risk is how we learn. Taking a risk is, oh, gee, I don't think I like that kind of cuisine. Take a risk, try it. Oh, I love it. So risk is a way of growing. That's my personal view. Take those risks, you grow, you learn. Maybe it fails. And even from that, you'll learn.
Well, they say that 99% of things you're worrying about when you take a risk never happen anyway. So why are we focusing on the 99%?
Well, because we've been told that that word risk is inherently a fearful thing. I get excited by risk. To me, people say risk reward. Rather than reward, I would say risk opportunity. Because without the risk, where are the opportunities going to come from?
Getting back to Royal Ontario Museum, you've always said that the museum plays a vital role in society, which is something absolutely true. What role do museums play in terms of connecting a community?
I think when you look at the history of museums, and the Royal Ontario Museum is an over 100-year-old institution. So it is in that classic model that people think of: the British Museum, the Louvre, the great European museums, of course, great New York museums, be they visual arts or natural history, that along with many other cultural organizations, I could say from my previous work in performing arts, is the Metropolitan Opera an intimidating institution? Is your local dance institution intimidating if you don't feel that you are either invited or welcome, or that you will understand the experience? So I think the way these institutions do play a vital role, and where increasingly I have seen over the last 2 decades in both performing arts and the museum world, is institutions thinking more seriously about making that invitation. It's no longer that, the temple on the hill where it's up to you to find us and we will enlighten you and you will be enriched because you walked through our doors. You have to reach out and say, why are we going to give you an experience that resonates with you personally? Toronto, as I think you probably know, is one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world. The UN often says it is the most culturally diverse, most languages spoken. It is very much a diaspora community. So how do you say to a new Canadian, we want to invite you in to see both the culture where you come from and that resonates with you reflected in a museum that is also showing cultures from around the world? So how do you find your place in a museum or a visual arts gallery if we can't reflect your understanding back to you? So I think that's one of the important things that more and more large cultural organizations are doing, saying we really do need to meet visitors and audiences where they are, and then hopefully they will allow us to take them on a journey of discovery.
What do you think people, including business leaders, still today misunderstand about the value of arts and culture in society?
There was just a story in our national newspaper yesterday about the challenges of raising funds for the arts, which has obviously been a longstanding challenge. I think one of the issues is there's a notion that the whole category that is broadly called nonprofit, which embraces education, healthcare, social services, and arts and culture. So sometimes you will hear, well, the arts are a nice to have, but healthcare is a must have. My response to that is we shouldn't even position that those are choices. It's not an either or. Unfortunately, we have many, many enlightened, wonderful donors, both philanthropists, corporations, foundations, who do recognize that every one of those verticals has to be supported. I think one of the other common misconceptions is that, well, it's already funded by government. It's already funded by my taxes. So why do you need me to now give you more? And of course, as we know, public sector, even in Canada, more so, of course, in the US, it varies around the world. In Europe, the arts are more generously funded by government, but there's always that sense of, well, I kind of gave through my taxes. So you have to, explain where the need comes from. And the other misconception that is something I've really been focused on for a few years. And my colleagues know I often say, I would like to rename the not-for-profit sector the not-for-dividend sector, because we are raising money. We are generating revenue. We are running, in most cases, like a business. We just take the money we earn and we put it back into our mission and our institutions. We don't pay it back out to shareholders. So we are incredibly efficient, incredibly conscientious businesses that run on the funds we receive with the goal of not running a deficit, breaking even, funding our mission. But we have many, many practices that are very similar to commercial enterprises. We sell tickets, we sell merchandise, we trade with other organizations. So I think those are a few of the common misperceptions of just this, you always have your hand out idea. And then what is the return on investment? What is the impact? But that leads to a whole different question around, the impact and the importance of culture in our societies.
I love not for dividend instead of not for profit. It's absolutely amazing. I've never heard that before, and it's brilliant. But you're absolutely correct. The Royal Ontario Museum, it's a business. It's the fact that you put profits back into it doesn't mean you don't have to operate it as cleanly and as efficiently as any good business should be. How do you balance the mission of the museum against the fact that you have operational realities, you need to make money?
I could say that about any of the large cultural organizations in our country and around the world. You do have to think about, sometimes it's a balancing act. I had an amazing, wonderful board member and impresario early in my career when I was working at Roy Thompson Hall, which is a classical music venue and popular music venue, but it's a music venue. And I had a wonderful board member elderly gentleman, Austrian gentleman who had founded vocal festivals, had really been in the business for a long time. And we were having a meeting where we talked about, okay, well, if we book this act, it's really, really important to bring that music or that orchestra or that artist to our stages. They're not going to make a lot of money, but then we have this act, and of course that's part of the job. What's going to, how is it all going to balance out? That's why you get this notion of blockbusters, as they say in the museum world, or Broadway hits in the performing arts world. And the wonderful late Nicholas Goldschmidt at a board meeting, when he was trying to explain to a board member who was more from the business world, and the board member was trying to understand this. Well, shouldn't everything make money? Like, why are you even booking anything that doesn't turn a profit? And Nicholas Goldschmidt said to the board, "The Beatles pay for Mozart." That was his answer. The Beatles pay for Mozart. And he was, I think, 90 years old at the time he said that. And I was very young in my career. And that is the quintessential thing. It's finding that balance in that not for dividend world. You have a mission. You have a purpose you have to fulfill. You have an educational purpose. You have all these things you're trying to accomplish. But yes, you know what? If you're going to do Shakespeare plays, you can also deliver a fabulously produced and fun Broadway musical for your audiences as well. And that's The Beatles Pay for Mozart.
What do you think is misunderstood about not-for-profit leadership, particularly with something of the scale of the Royal Ontario Museum? What do you think people don't quite understand about leading something like that?
Well, I've already touched on the fact that I don't think they understand how many of the exact same business principles apply. The same budgets and finances, big HR departments, unions, physical facilities, so many similar things that are not that different from operating any large business, especially one that has a physical plant or a manufacturing division. Interestingly, you may be surprised to hear where I'm going to go with this one. What I think is not well understood about what's involved in leadership at large arts organizations or cultural organizations is what a rewarding in terms of the satisfaction you get from your job and rewarding from a financial perspective these jobs can be. This notion that, I'm an MBA student, so I couldn't possibly go into the nonprofit sector, and be that hospitals or higher education or culture, because I'll be impoverished. And the fact is, just building on everything else we've just talked about, these are highly, highly in-demand jobs that require outstanding executive leadership skills. And they are, in fact, increasingly compensated in an appropriate manner. So because you want to follow your heart and lead a large arts organization does not mean you're going to be living in a garret. There are very well-paying jobs at every level of management and executive leadership in the nonprofit sector. And so I often give talks to MBA students, and my slideshow says how you can do good and still do well. Because there are young people who actually do want a career in a mission-driven kind of field, and they've made this assumption that, well, that means I'm never going to have a good salary, and it's just not true.
Talking about, you mentioned about donors earlier. Relationships and partnerships in business are crucial, and as they are in life. How do you build strong partnerships and relationships with businesses you rely on, and in particularly donors?
I will speak for me and the way I have worked successfully with donors in the past. The first and most important thing I do is, obviously the practical things is you look at their history of giving, you look at where their passions lie, and this applies to corporations as well. So I've been in organizations sometimes where someone has said, "Oh, let's go and meet with this company or this donor," and I've said, "Well, you never say never, but I've looked at their profile and it doesn't seem to me that what we do is what they're particularly interested in right now, or that's not where their corporate giving." And that changes often every 3 to 5 years. Corporations maybe adjust, but I ask them. So the first thing I do is say, I don't go and immediately start pitching them on something. I say, what are your giving objectives, be it in the corporate space or the individual philanthropic space? What do you try to accomplish with your giving, with your investments into nonprofit organizations? And then they'll talk about it. And then, hopefully not too frequently, I hope only 2 out of 10 times versus 9 out of 10 times, I will say, I think that's really wonderful and it's commendable and you are making a big impact there. And that's not really a space that we're in right now where I could actually give you an opportunity that I think would make you happy. But you learn that. And then what you do learn, because you have learned what makes them happy, then you can begin a conversation about, what resonates, this, that. But the other thing is to keep the relationship going in a really authentic way. If you have a donor who's really passionate about your organization, this might transfer to the investor world as well. If anyone listening is in the for-profit sector, you can't just engage with them in a transactional way. At the moment that the transaction happens, you have to keep, you have to remember to send the cards. You have to know the names of their kids and their grandkids and authentically want to know. You have to ask them how things are doing. You have to sometimes plan a call with them that is just, hey, I thought you might be interested in knowing this, or this is happening here, or maybe even in another institution. And I thought of you. I thought that would be interesting to you. And there's no ask there. It's a relationship. It's like, a relationship has to be a two-way street, and it can't just all be ask, give.
Speaking of building relationships, you're building something very exciting at the museum, aren't you?
We are. When you're running an operation that is open 6 days a week and welcomes thousands and thousands of visitors, families, school programs, educational programs, and then you say, we think we'd like to do a major construction project in and around that, for many of the reasons we've just talked about, you're not going to close your operation. You just can't. Museums do. There are ways that capital projects happen where it is planned that the facility will not be available to the public for X number of years. But ROM made the decision to renovate and expand and beautify and make more accessible an entrance 20 years after the last renovation of that space, and do it without closing the museum. So there's a project now called Open ROM. We have an amazing donor family attached who made a significant gift to make that happen. So operating the museum, it's like moving jigsaw pieces where, well, that's now open, but now we have to move over here. But that's exciting. But that brings up the fact that when you're running large cultural enterprises, every once in a while you get to operate for 5 or 10 years or sometimes longer than that, just with your programming as the main thing you're raising money for. And then inevitably, that capital project comes along, and suddenly you have to also ask people to help you raise money for your facilities to either expand them, repair them, enhance them, update them, etc. So you still have to raise money for the regular programs, but we are raising money for capital right now as well.
You're clearly such an incredible person, and talking of you personally, you've been named as one of the CEO magazine's top 50 women over 50. What does that mean to you at this stage of your career?
I love that you added that extra sentence, because if you'd said, what does it mean to me? Of course, it's an incredible honor. And you think, well, it's nice to know that you work hard and you try to do well and run a great operation as a CEO, and to be recognized for that is wonderful. But I love that you added at this stage in your career, because I would say, as we, have, International Women's Month coming up, as it were, I have actually been doing this for quite some time. And for me, it's just so incredibly rewarding to see that from when I started my career, and I was a rare female in an executive boardroom, or the constant first woman to be appointed to this, or the first woman to ever do that. And back in a time where it still was challenging. There were still mores and customs that we would not accept nowadays that you had to manage through as a young woman in your career. So I would say one of the reasons it means so much to me now is that I can look and see how many more women are being given these fantastic opportunities, how many more women are being recognized as great leaders, and how many more women, hopefully, are finding it more accepted and more understood to be the norm, to be that woman in the boardroom.
What would you say to women in their mid to late 40s or 50s that might feel it's too late to aim higher or even pivot in a completely different direction professionally?
I mean, in some ways, my pivot from pretty much, media and then performing arts, pivoting to museum world, one would say, oh, well, that's a different kind of cultural entity, but the transferability is incredible. I would say a few things. I'd say, look at how transferable your skills are. Because honestly, there's a table of skills, we've touched on some of them, that are going to apply in many, many different sectors or in many fields. And if you're feeling a yearning to explore a different field, try to speak to some other leaders, be they male or female, to really say, what does that feel like? And you would be surprised how often they'll say, oh yeah, you could transfer everything you've learned and done over there to our sector if that's something you're interested in doing. So I think it is we're so much more fluid now with the skills matrix, that I'd say don't be afraid of that. Take the risk. But the other thing I would say is 65 as the retirement age. I think certainly in Canada and I maybe other places in North America, maybe less so in Europe, I don't know. That is now an old construct. I mean, people are working longer and longer. I have spectacular board members who are fantastic contributors, both to, from a leadership perspective and a council perspective to me, and also financially, who are not stopping working and they're in their late 70s or 80s and they're making fantastic contributions. So I do think it is more and more accepted in society now that people are going to work until they feel they are no longer able to contribute, they're not doing a great job, or they're no longer interested in doing that. They want to do other things with their life. So I would just say the age thing is almost really a non-topic.
Janice, you've sustained a long and high-level career. How have you avoided burnout, and what advice would you give to people to stop that?
I've always been very excited by the work I do and energized by it. This is a demanding sector. Often, I've said to some of my team members, especially in the performing arts world, our work is other people's leisure. So it's not up to them to care that you have to be there till midnight because there's a show to put on. That's our work and that's their leisure. So just be conscious that you've made that choice, that this is the lifestyle. Interestingly, the way I have done it historically, and it was particularly easy in beautiful Banff, you actually get some quiet time. So especially when you're in a field like this that is so social and so there's always events and there's always entertaining and there's always people that you're meeting and greeting and talking to. So then the last thing for me when I go home, and I often throughout my career was living on my own. Now I have a wonderful husband here in Toronto, but I would just have quiet time, listen to music, go for walks, just try to get out of, that space and find whatever it is. I guess for some people it's, yoga or going to the gym or whatever. But the other way to avoid burnout, is to not get complacent in your job. Keep learning, keep pressing, keep being interested. And, burnout doesn't just come from too many demands. That can be a factor, obviously. Burnout comes from doing the same thing over and over and over again with no new stimulation and no new requirements that you think differently and do something differently, because that's what excites us. Newness excites us. It is a part of human nature that we need new things.
You've worked with some incredible people over your career. Who were the mentors that shaped you most? And probably more importantly, what did they teach you?
Well, they taught me that it's very important to be a mentor. It's one of the things that I really like to do and try to make time to do. I would say that I have staff working for me now at ROM who worked for me 20 years ago at Luminato and then worked for me again at Banff. So, you talked about building relationships with donors, but, I believe in building long-lasting relationships with my colleagues. You want to think that people would want to work for you again and work with you again. So that's also very rewarding because you see their growth in the field. I had an amazing, amazing mentor in Beverly Sills, the great American opera star who was the chairman of my board at Lincoln Center. She was an amazing fundraiser, an amazing relationship person. She was a big part of teaching me about it does have to be a personal relationship. You have to actually care. You have to listen. When they're talking about their grandkids, when you see them 6 months later, you need to remember those kids' names and ask how that soccer tournament went and actually mean it, actually remember and care. So you need to be present with people. She also had an amazing, I heard her once say to a colleague who said, well, her nickname was Bubbles. There's a book called Bubbles about Beverly Sills, the great American opera star. And he said, Beverly, you're running these big businesses and you've run the City Opera, you're running Lincoln Center, but you always seem so happy. And you've got a lot of stuff in your life and personal things as well, where her children had some health difficulties. And I'll remember this the rest of my life because it's a good way to go into work every day. She said, I'm not always happy, but I don't have to be happy to be cheerful.
Love it.
And I think leaders who bring their own baggage, maybe you're not happy, but you still have to come in and you have to be positive. You have to be an empathetic leader. You have to be supportive of your teams. So, you do have to be able to separate that. So that was one of my great mentor teachings. The other one that I'm very fond of, Richard Minette, artistic director of the Stratford Festival. And I spent a lot of time with him, and I traveled with him, and I went on to meetings with him, and we'd be in the back of a cab in downtown Toronto, or we'd be on an airplane, or we'd be coming in the stage door at the Stratford Festival. And he'd say to people, what would you think of if this or this happened? Or is this a show you would come and see? Or, he would ask everyone. And I know there were people who thought, well, why are you asking the stage doorman or a cab driver? But that to me was such genius. He had that common touch. He realized that's his audience. Everyone is his audience, and everyone has the right to have an opinion about what it is you're doing, be it in a museum, on the walls of an art gallery, or at one of the greatest theaters in the world, the Stratford Festival.
What's your advice for managing change? And when I say that, I mean that you've seen obviously many changes over the years, and the two key letters on everyone's minds at the moment is AI. I'd love to know, and I know the audience would, I'd love to know your thoughts on AI and what's going to happen in that space, especially in the arts and culture industry.
I think, as with any business or any leader, we're looking at how it can bring efficiencies to our work and how it can help us produce output per se. For me, I think it's more about an opportunity to have a tool that may make you look at something in a different way. So for us, and I think most of my colleagues in the cultural sector, when you hear us talk about AI, we'll talk about its impact on creativity. I think every business needs to be thinking about creativity, and creativity needs to be a part of what leaders have in their arsenal, and that it's important to them. But I think AI, everyone is aware of the risks or the concerns or the downsides. But I would say the creative potential of asking AI to answer some kind of question or help you think about a problem could definitely tap into a world of other ideas. But I do think also there is concern in the cultural sector around AI with respect to intellectual property. And how do artists protect their work, protect their voices, their images? That's their livelihood, the visual works they create. So I do think there's going to be a period of discovery over the next couple of years that is about how do we use AI productively, but not have it actually rob people of their intellectual property.
When your chapter at the Royal Ontario Museum is eventually written, what do you hope that chapter says?
I think I would like to expand not just our museum, but generally museums can be somewhat conservative places. I'd like to bring more creativity to the way we raise funds and the way we deliver for donors in every stream of donations, corporate, philanthropic, foundations, that we do bring more creativity to it, that we make it more of a partnership. There's always going to be a place for, when you give this many dollars, your name's going to be on this list of people or in this house program. I think with new technologies, with digital, with all the tools we have at our disposal, with actually letting the donors voice their thoughts on what would make their contribution really meaningful to them. I'd like to think that the amount of funds that are raised currently at the Royal Ontario Museum, the ways they're raised, and the way those funds have created these more synergistic partnerships with the donors, that those things have actually seen meaningful change.
At CEO Behind the Scenes, we always close with the same two questions. So firstly, what's one thing you've changed your mind about recently and why?
I think one thing I have changed my mind about is new technologies. I, like many, was concerned, and I have, partly because, as I said earlier, surround yourself with great people. Hire really, really great people. Don't be afraid to hire a person who actually wants your job and hopefully in X number of years could do your job. Those are the people you want around you. So I have brilliant younger folks around me who have really opened my eyes to, as I say, the creative opportunities around some of these new technologies. And that's one thing I've changed my mind about, because I was, not that I wasn't ever going to use it, but I guess what's changed is my level of concern about it, and trepidation has changed to a more positive view of how it can be used.
And on the flip side, what's one thing you've not changed your mind about? It could be a belief that you'd want to share to help others lead or live better.
I haven't changed my mind about being authentic, being your authentic self. I had an experience, probably, I'd say mid to late high mid career, where I was being interviewed for a very important role. Might have been in the United States, I can't remember. One of my references was called by the executive recruitment firm, and they said, yeah, we had this great interview, and we were really impressed by Janice, but we want to ask you, like, really what she really like. Like, that's one thing in the interview setting, but tell us about the real Janice. And this person who I had worked with, he had been on one of my boards, actually said, so how long did you spend with her? A couple of hours. And he said, what you see is what you get. Like, if you spent that much time with her, I can't add anything to that. You can like her or not like her. You can think she's the right candidate or not, but you always get the real thing. And that is something I have never changed. You've got to be your authentic self. You don't have to, if there's something you disagree with, there's always ways, and there's always diplomatic ways to manage around that. But don't ever be anything but your authentic self. That's the path to success.
Janice, thank you for sharing your perspective on leadership, culture, and courage, and for reminding us why institutions like ROM matter so deeply to society. To our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, please leave a review, and more importantly, share it with someone who would be inspired by Janice's story. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on CEO Behind the Scenes.